Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast about your Kindle, books, and all things Amazon. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is January 11th, 2019. Welcome from lower downtown Denver, known in these parts as Lodo. It's been trying to snow most of the day with no accumulation, but some pleasing white patterns that we can see through our windows on the 11th floor of our mile-high home. Since returning here from Cambridge, Mass. More than a week ago, I've kept to a weekday practice of swimming for a half hour. There's a saltwater pool and a club across the street, so I'm in pretty good shape, losing some weight and feeling pretty trim here in Colorado, which is the way Colorado is. I love both Cambridge and Denver. Probably in Denver, I am drawn to more healthy exercise, eating sensibly, and in Cambridge, maybe my head is a little more full of ideas, but both two great cities, that's for sure. I hope your new year is off to a good start, that you're still gaining inspiration from whatever resolutions you made. The other one that I haven't broken yet is to practice my guitar for a half hour each day, and I'm currently working on Those Were the Days, sung by Mary Hopkin. My guitar teacher, Steve Netsky, informs me that you can't copyright a chord progression, so I think it'll be safe for me to play a few chords for you from that song in the outro. My guest this week is Dave Addey, a designer and software developer who last month traditionally published a one-of-a-kind book titled Typeset in the Future, Typography and Design in Science Fiction Movies. Now, if you're a fan of the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, Star Wars, or 5 other major science fiction movies, this book will give you an excuse to watch your favorite film yet again, and that seems to be driving considerable interest in Dave's creation.
So much of this stuff that when we watch 2001 today makes it feel fresh, makes it still feel futuristic, was way ahead of its time at the time that the movie was created.
It's been a week full of Amazon-related news, from the announcement of Jeff and MacKenzie Bezos' getting a divorce to Amazon package deliveries in your garage, and the release finally of Echo Auto for your car, plus a new source of free movies and TV shows from Amazon's first acquisition 20 years ago. That would be IMDB, the movie database. I'd like to start out the news today considering a lengthy article that Craig Maud published in Wired magazine on December 20th, and the title is "The Future Book is Here, but It's Not What We Expected." I heard about this via Twitter from Will Delamater of the EduKindle blog, long-running blog about use of Kindles in schools. And it's a meaty article. I've read it twice. Craig Maud is quite a thinker on the point of publishing, and he's been following the Kindle right from the start. And in this article, he goes further back, all the way back to 1968, when a researcher named Alan Kay made a cardboard prototype of a tablet-like device. He called it the Dynabook, and he said, quote, "We created a new kind of medium for boosting human thought, for amplifying human intellectual endeavor. We thought it could be as significant as Gutenberg's invention of the printing press 500 years ago." Well, that sounds kind of like the iPad, which came in 2010. I love this article because it was a history of my interest in ebooks, and it does go back to the hypertext, which was a form of book which was pioneered by Eastgate Press that was actually in Watertown, right next to Cambridge, Mass., and I spoke with some of those people there. There was the whole hyperlinks idea of books, and the aspiration that many of us had, I think, before the Kindle, and then certainly turbocharged when the Kindle came around and the iPad, was that somehow technology was going to turn reading into some kind of a new, moving, location-aware, anything that technology could enable to do. It was not hard to imagine that we were going to be holding something in our hand 10 years hence that would look very different from the book or from that original Kindle in 2007. And Craig tells the story that That actually, it didn't happen, but he takes a different tack than I sometimes see in the media, which is kind of a gloating that, well, all those reports of print being dead, turns out those aren't true because ebook reading has stabilized at a certain level and there are plenty of print books around. What he argues in this piece is that so much of what we read and how we consume stories, really, it's even beyond reading, has changed in the last 10 years, and that the whole infrastructure or ecosystem of how authors get stories to readers, if you look at it from a wide lens the way he does, you see some pretty phenomenal changes. For example, of course, one of the big ones is Amazon's role. At the end of 2017, Amazon was responsible for 83% of ebook sales in the U.S. and 45% of print sales. And because of the indie publishing phenomenon, which Amazon started with Kindle Direct Publishing in 2007, about half of all author earnings are coming from indie publishing, and that's not more sales, number of books, but the royalties that they're earning are 70% versus about 25% in traditional publishing. And that so that vibrant indie sector is part of what he sees is a recreation of the book, because there's so many authors that this is kind of my words, based on authors that I've talked with, indie authors who have found audiences, writing mysteries, some of the ones we've talked to in the last few weeks. All of that material is now part of what we think of as a book. And however we read it, we're reading new and more widely available writers than we ever did before. He expands the whole notion of what a book is. I think in some ways it's a little too broad. It's comprehensive, it's exciting and intriguing the way he adds not just books that we read, but newsletters. There are people publishing essentially books, the things which get you to think and long-form writing, to lists of subscribers, somewhat like my Kindle Chronicles email list, which has about 450 people on it. Craig Modd has a list that goes out to 10,000 people, and he sends out, maybe 6 times a year, a long, thoughtful piece on some topic that's of interest to him, and these 10,000 people are receiving it free. So he's publishing in that form. And he makes a convincing case that for authors who are depending on platforms like Twitter or Facebook or other social media platforms that are controlled by a company, that the email way of getting to readers is a lot more secure from the author's point of view. You own that list, you can print it out on paper, and nobody can pull the rug out between you and your readers. Audiobooks, a huge increase in audiobooks. He captures in this evolution of a broader view of the book. He had one thing which I take issue with. He tells a story of using a Kindle Oasis, which he has and admires the same way I do, on a trail somewhere in Japan, and reading a story about, I think it was by someone he knew who had died, and he had a strong urge to leave a comment somehow, but he couldn't. Well, either the Oasis didn't have 3G service or it wasn't available on the particular trail, but I've had the experience on my Oasis of reading in the middle of the night and coming across something that I wanted to comment on, a quote that I wanted to put up on Twitter. I could also do it on Facebook. I don't think I do it as often on Facebook. So the way to connect with people directly from the Kindle Oasis certainly exists. If you've got Wi-Fi working, it works that way. And if you've got a 3G model, it also works that way. But everything else in this article resonated quite well with my experience of how books and reading and technology have evolved over the past 10 years. And if you have a similar level of interest in this broader sweep of things as mine, I think you'll enjoy reading it. There's a couple of quotes that I'll share with you. He says, "Our future book is composed of email, tweets, YouTube videos, mailing lists, crowdfunding campaigns, PDF to Mobi converters, Amazon warehouses, and a surge of hyper-affordable offset printers in places like Hong Kong." I think that's a reference to the print on demand and the quality of print on demand books that are available. The future book is here and continues to evolve. You're holding it. It's exciting. It's boring. It's more important than it's ever been. Good article by Craig Maud. I sent out a invitation to him by email. He's very he's a busy guy, and he's also written about how he's trying to control his distractions and stay focused on his work. So I think the chances that I'll break through to him in a way that results in an interview next week are quite low. But I was jazzed up enough about this article to see if maybe we could continue the conversation with him in person or by Skype next week. I have some other news items. You'll find links to these in the show notes, but I'll mention them to you briefly. Dave Limp, who's head of Amazon Devices, released a number which had some significance, given that Amazon's usually pretty cautious about putting out any kind of number about sales, saying that there are now 100 million Alexa devices in homes that have been sold. Now, they didn't break down what share of those were Amazon devices like the Echo and the Dot versus third-party devices who have Alexa on board. And Dave Limp does say in the story that third-party devices with Alexa may someday, quote, exceed the ones that Amazon's making themselves. It was an estimate by a third-party researcher of the breakdown of home assistant devices showing Amazon's commanding lead. 23% of all of the devices installed, I assume this is in the U.S., were Echo, the tall Alexa device, and the 21% were the Dot. That makes 44%.
I don't know that one.
That makes 44% for the Amazon devices. By comparison, the Google Home only has 8% of the share of the home, and there wasn't a number for Siri. I have a Google Home device in Cambridge at our home there, and I've enjoyed having it to compare, but I've had the Home and the Apple HomePod and Alexa all on that desk there, and for a while, I was asking questions of each of them. I was using the HomePod for music mainly because I have an iTunes Music account. But I just stopped using the Google Home, and when it came to figuring out what to bring with me to Denver, I didn't bring the Google Home device, and I don't think I'll get a second one to have here. It's not that it's a poor choice, and actually the AI is pretty robust, and there are sometimes questions that I think it handles better than Alexa, but we're an Alexa family, and when I'm actually just when I need an answer or to get something done, I turn to the Echo device. Another story I noticed this week involves something called Amazon Showroom, and this is like something that I was trying several months ago on my iPhone. It was an IKEA app that enabled me to find something on the IKEA catalog and place it in my room using kind of an augmented reality where you could actually see how big it was compared to the other things in the room. Well, now Amazon has it. You can find it by going to the Amazon app on your smartphone, and then you go to Shop by Department and Home and Kitchen. Then there are some categories. I was looking at lighting, and I ended up at desk lamps. Actually, table lamps is the place where I found one. I looked at a lot of devices before I could find one that actually had this feature of the Amazon Showroom. But when I found it, there was View in Your Room was a link underneath pictures of it. And when I did that, I had to choose between placing the item on the floor, on the tabletop, or the countertop, and then tap in a blue circle. At that point, it was pretty cool because I chose a light and I could virtually put it on my desk here. And if I pushed it with one finger back toward the far end of the desk, it got smaller. The perspective was right. And then with two fingers, I could turn it around so I could see the 360-degree view of it. Quite a robust implementation of it. It's not on very many items, I think, at this point, but as it gets to be more commonly linked with items on Amazon, that's going to be an interesting feature that will help to, especially for furniture, things like that, where you want to see how something will look in your home. Amazon Showroom. Also in news, expansion of the Amazon Key capability. I was an early adopter of that in Cambridge because now we can have packages delivered inside our home there. There's a camera that shows the delivery man announcing himself, knocking, ringing the doorbell, and then very cautiously cracking the door open enough just to leave the package. Well, we're soon going to be able to do that with a garage, and since Starlee and I are building a garage at our home there, that's going to be a nice feature. The way it will work is that the delivery person will have a similar ability to get the garage open, in this case by an automatic garage door opener, and it has to be a certain kind or protocol for garage door openers to work. The package will be placed in the garage. The delivery person will be told not to put it in the path of the car so that you're not going to drive over packages when you come into the garage. And I think actually you can place a mat and say this is where to leave it. Might be good for larger items to leave in a garage, and it also might, if you've got a pet in the house, then the garage is separate, then it's an alternate place to put it. I've got a possible conflict in our garage because the other thing that I'm really looking forward to when we get the garage finished is that's where we're going to keep the Tesla. And the Tesla has this summon ability so that I think that I will be able to stand in the living room of the house looking out the window and tap on the Tesla app, which will be hooked up to the garage door opener. The garage door will open and the Tesla will back out onto the driveway, and of course be heated or cooled depending on the weather. But I've got to make sure that the garage door opener that is going to work with the Tesla is also going to work with the Amazon Key. I'd hate to have to choose between being able to get the Tesla out of the garage with Summon and getting packages left in the garage by the Amazon people. So when you're pushing as hard as I am to get the smart home really smart, sometimes the protocols end up mixing you up or causing some problems. Finally, news. I don't have much to say about news that Jeff and MacKenzie Bezos are divorcing. That's very sad. I mean, everything we've seen in the sanitized view of their lives is kind of a model family with kids and spending time at home. And so here comes this news of a divorce. On the outer edges of the respectable media, there are reports that he may have had a relationship with someone outside the marriage, and it'll be interesting to see if those reports start getting into the more respectable media than the places that I'm not going to quote anything from them at this point, except that I see them bubbling up, and I hope there's not too much of that because it's a distraction. It's a business matter because he owns 16.3% of Amazon shares, and depending on whether there was a prenup or a postnup, how everything gets settled, then there's an effect on his ownership and control of the company. The next largest owners, according to Wall Street Journal story, are Vanguard Group and BlackRock Group, which each have slightly more than 5%. So even if he gets half of that 16.3% stake, he'll still be the largest shareholder in Amazon. Sad news, but life goes on. For the tech tip, Readwise, which is a great app for bringing back highlights of books that you've read years ago and bringing them to your inbox. It's now easier to use because it has autosync. It's pulling your highlights in the background. You don't have to sort of go to the Amazon Highlights site to renew the Readwise supply of your highlights. So this is a pretty big update that they announced just recently, and I'll have a link to that site in the show notes. Time now for the interview. I heard about Dave Addey's unusual book, Typeset in the Future, from listener Shimon Schott, who received a copy for Christmas in Warsaw and fell in love with it. Dave is a Brit, a graduate of the University of Warwick in mathematics, and he owns an app development agency named Agant Limited. I connected with him by Skype on Tuesday and began by asking him what led to his spending 4 years writing this unusual book.
In 2014, I started spotting the same fonts in every single sci-fi movie I watched. And once I'd seen it, I couldn't stop seeing it. It was everywhere. So this intrigued me. I did a bit of research and found out it was Eurostyle Bold Extended. And it seemed that this all began with 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I took the time to do some research. I wrote an article about how 2001: A Space Odyssey used this font to make things feel futuristic. And to my surprise, it went viral and took down my web hosting server. It costed me $1,200 in internet overage bandwidth fees in the process. So I thought, maybe I'm onto something. Maybe other people find this interesting as well. This led to more articles, and ultimately led to a book, Typeset in the Future, that you have there on your Kindle.
Well, who are these people? You've got a nice Venn diagram of people that are interested in fonts and people who are interested in sci-fi, and to my mind, the overlap might be fairly small, but apparently not.
To my surprise and delight, it turns out I am not the only person on the internet in that intersection. It seems in particular people who like to go deep into sci-fi, and particularly how sci-fi tackles world building and designing these visions of the future, also have just a general love of design and typography and creative design in particular. So yes, it turns out there are an awful lot of people who particularly, I think, like to have an excuse to watch their favorite sci-fi movies again through a different way of looking at them, from studying how they create these visions of the future.
How many times would you guess you've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Oh my goodness. Well, before writing the book, a few. After writing the book, I actually have lost count. Every single one of the 7 movies in here I have watched so many times, mostly watching out what's on the wall in the background, actually, rather than watching the foreground, that I have literally lost count as to how many times I've seen them.
And in order to do the kind of research that you've done on this book, I assume you're watching them on a device that you can pause so that you can really get a close look at the fonts.
The first pass for any of these chapters is to work through the movie and take screenshots of anything and everything that might possibly be interesting, usually ending up with a few hundred screenshots from each movie. And then to catalog those and take those as the starting point for further research. Sometimes that's looking at typography, sometimes it's looking at a product that appears on screen in the background. It really depends on the movie, but that gives me those jumping off points for further research and further rabbit holes that I can go down in discovering more about what we see on screen.
The book has been out just about a month. You published it December 11th. What's been the most surprising response so far?
I think the number of people who have really enjoyed going as deep into these movies as I have. It's always an interesting thing when you put a book like this out there, is just how are people going to respond to 8,000 words on the design of WALL-E? And it's been really gratifying to see people both appreciate the depth of research, because by goodness it took a lot of time, but also really appreciate the chance it gives them to see these movies in a different way. I think there hasn't been one response; it's been many, many different responses. That's been consistent across all of them, and that's been really, really gratifying. It makes the work worthwhile.
I would think it would be intimidating to write on a subject like this, which is so populated by avid fans, people that really are in some ways obsessed with the thing that you're writing about, and that would unleash a lot of corrections and things that would leave you planning to have to update the book very soon.
You would be correct. The first 4 articles I wrote on the blog, which became chapters in the book after much expansion, they had the advantage of being blog posts that had been on the internet for a couple of years, and many people had, to their eternal credit and my gratitude, posted corrections, additional facts, their own research. One guy discovered where a random piece of text on a screen in Blade Runner was from. It was from an advert from a 1980s computer magazine, and he posted the magazine screen. So all of these corrections and additional things that had been added. But there are 3 chapters in the book which have never been blog posts, and one of those happens to be on the subject of Star Trek, which is a subject that of all the sci-fi universes is possibly the most beloved of all, maybe between that and Star Wars, and certainly one that many people know in much, much more detail than I do. So yes, it was definitely intimidating to try and do that justice, I think. But the great thing is, in all the research I did, I found other people who had already looked into it, who were very willing to help me in my research and share their discoveries, and that really helped in making sure that I was doing that franchise justice.
Hmm. Well, I follow Amazon pretty closely, and so I've known that Star Trek was really important to Jeff Bezos when he was a boy, and there's a lot of sly references to it in things. I think that the fact that one of the wake words for Alexa is computer, which I think comes out of Star Trek.
Yes.
And but I assume you're pretty familiar with Star Trek, and if somebody was obsessed with Star Trek at an early age and now is running a major technology company, does that tell you anything about his view, just because you know that he formed his soul and his mind attracted to that particular show?
That is fascinating. Well, Star Trek, the more I dug into it, the more I came to realize that Star Trek's actually quite unusual in sci-fi for being primarily utopian. Most of the sci-fi things that I studied, even something like WALL-E, which is theoretically utopia, and actually in practice is kind of showing the worst of that as well, the worst of having robots that serve us. So I don't know. I would be very interested to see whether that utopian view of the world has influenced how he's approached the company. I don't have any immediate examples myself, but I certainly think it's an intriguing choice for him to model it upon. One of the things I did find that surprised me when I was digging into Star Trek was discovering how closely in Star Trek: The Motion Picture the branding, if you will, the styling of Starfleet follows the United Nations branding. They actually, the designers very closely used both the color scheme and the kind of the globe motif of the United Nations, and it was interesting to see how they use that existing association we have, maybe without even realizing it, to give us this kind of prompt as to their Starfleet's role in the universe in this movie, without ever explicitly saying they are the United Nations. But I cannot speak for Jeff to know whether he has similar inspiration.
One thing that I've thought is he has a very long-term horizon to things that he does. I mean, he's famously invested in this 10,000-year clock. And a lot of his management of Amazon, at least in how he describes it, is his job is to work on things that won't even come to light for 5 or 10 years. Perhaps that would just relate to someone who had a science fiction interest, because science fiction by its nature is projecting way out into the future.
Absolutely. And one of the roles of, I think, Star Trek, one of the influences of Star Trek, rather, I discovered this during my interview with Mike Okuda, who was the scenic set designer for many of the different Star Trek incarnations, is a lot of the things that were imagined for Star Trek were inspirations for people who watched the show when they were kids or when they were growing up. And the inspiration it gave them was, I want to make that a reality. I want to figure out how to make a transporter or make this communicator. And one of the greatest things that I learned from Mike is discovering just how many of the people he had met through being an integral part of Star Trek fandom had become scientists because they wanted to be like Mr. Spock, because they wanted to be able to create the things they saw on screen. And I think as far as legacies that any franchise can have, that's as good as it gets, to have had that impact and that aspirational impact on people is fantastic.
Well, now, the 2001, now that was 1968. Star Trek, the TV show started in the 70s, or?
Oh, gosh, you're putting me on the spot here. 66? If I have that wrong, I do apologize. Late 60s, I believe. Slightly before 2001.
So, and Arthur C. Clarke was co-wrote the screenplay for 2001, and he's, I guess, one of the big three in science fiction writers of the century. Was he a formative influence in your interest in science fiction, or what role does Arthur C. Clarke play in this whole interest in science fiction?
Well, I think he's both gained and kept that stature, that position, partly because of how effective he was, how good he was at the prescience, at predicting what might come in the future. There's a piece I found in the promotional materials for MGM's promotional materials for 2001, where he wrote an article about the electronic library, a marvel of the future. I actually have a snippet of it here where he says, one can thus envisage a central library or memory bank which would be a permanent part of the world communications network. Readers and scholars could call for any document from the Declaration of Independence to the current bestseller and see it flashed on their screens. And this was written in, 1967, 1968. He's basically defining and inventing the internet. You could couple that with a Kindle device. We have the IBM Telepad in the movie, which is a Kindle or iPad under any other name. And so much of this stuff that when we watch 2001 today makes it feel fresh, makes it still feel futuristic, was way ahead of its time at the time that the movie was created. A lot of that also, I think, for 2001 in particular, came from the way the production company, the producers of the movie worked with present-day companies to borrow and use and include their prototypes in the movie. So that 40-odd companies, I think, they basically borrowed stuff from and put it in the film because they knew it gave them the best chance of looking futuristic. But even little things like seat back entertainment systems in a plane. Here it's a plane to the moon, but it's still a plane.
Yeah.
We watch that today and we think, well, of course there are seat back entertainment systems on a plane. That wasn't the case in the late 60s. That was fantastical to the audience at the time. I think because they tapped into these companies' own predictions and own prototypes, they managed to keep themselves fresh even today. In a way that very, very few other movies have managed.
One of the things in 2001 is the fear of rogue space-based computer systems, HAL, and sorry, I can't do that. Is that prescient in the sense that people still have that fear, or sometimes it seems like that isn't as much of a fear except by people, well, Elon Musk and other people that are really thinking about it, but in the general public, I'm not sure that fear is as much a thing as it might have been in 1968.
Agreed, and that partly maybe that's the way our relationship with computers has changed since 1968. They were far less prevalent and far more mysterious. When we see HAL's memory center, it's room sized in the way that computers were then, but he's almost spaceship sized. So he's very much a 60s scale computer. That said, I think particularly a movie like Her from relatively recently, in which the only interface to the computer is through voice and is through this AI, is doing a good job of taking our present day and extrapolating it just that bit further in the same way that 2001 did for a 1960s audience. Black Mirror, similarly, is great at doing that. Let's just take things to their logical conclusion and see how terrifying they become. So I think sci-fi is continuing that trend. Also riffing on the fact that we now have this association with HAL. Moon, one of the movies studied in the book, actually subverts that very neatly by, we assume that its computer is evil. I won't spoil the movie, because we have that association with HAL, with this deadpan voice. And the reality actually turns out to be much more complex, which is definitely taking advantage of our preconceptions of evil space-based computers.
I've wondered when you see the rise of what some people are calling voice-first technology and dealing with computers through voice instead of text, do you have a sense that we might be approaching the end of text as the main interface, and thus fonts, whether they're futuristic or not, are just sort of a relic of a past as opposed to something that really can still indicate the future?
Excellent question. Well, for all of this, I think we have to, at least as far as the book goes, it's all being considered in the context of telling a story through a movie. And that always means that what we're seeing is not necessarily a true reality of how a computer interface should work or how these things work in practice, because really its primary aim is to tell a story through a visual and audio medium. So, for example, we see a lot of video calling in sci-fi movies. We always have, even from 2001 had it, but today as well. And oftentimes it's really not the best way for people to keep in touch. There's no need for them to be on a video screen, but it suits the medium. It means we can see both characters without them having to be in the same physical location. And I think having audio-based inputs in a movie satisfies a similar need. We can have personality that you cannot express through just words on screen. We can have the expressivity that you get, for example, in the voice of the computer in Her. So as it appears in sci-fi movies, I think it's as much for an emotive storytelling purpose as it is a prediction of the future of computing. In reality, we still have a little way to go before voice detection and voice synthesis is as good as it needs to be a true replacement for other input forms.
Exactly. When you pull back to the larger questions that science fiction addresses, are we alone? Is there other life in space? Where do you come down on some of those speculations?
I certainly am of the opinion that we are not alone. There is some life of some form out there somewhere. Whether it's anywhere near enough to us that we will ever encounter it is a whole different matter. But following the principle of if we want to inspire people to take us to Mars, to take us beyond Mars, then sci-fi showing what might happen if we did is once again a good inspiration.
Yeah. It's an energizing force to the imagination to posit it, and then people can fill in the spaces on how we might find out.
Exactly.
Your book is fascinating. I had the listener who is from Warsaw who first told me about the book and said, you need to get this guy on the show. He quoted his wife. He said it was his favorite Christmas present. He must have somebody gave it to him for Christmas, I assume in print. And his wife's comment was, it's amazing that someone would delve into such a topic and write a book about it. It's even more amazing that someone would care to read about it. So, and then I think of the publication process, a book that many people might assume would have a fairly niche audience. You didn't just self-publish it, which I thought, well, a book like this, it probably was self-published because you can do that now. You found, it looks like a pretty established publishing house, Abrams. Tell me about them and how you ended up having the book published by them.
Well, it certainly made a difference. I think probably in practice all the difference for an established publisher that having created several of these posts in the same level of detail as would be needed for a book, but created them in blog form and seen from multiple times. Each post had gone viral, had been featured, and we actually had numbers as to how many people had read them, albeit for free, but nonetheless, how many people had taken the time to read this level of detail on this subject. So that definitely helped, I think, to give confidence that there was an audience. The actual connection came from Matt Zodasites, the movie critic, who is the editor-in-chief at RogerEbert.com. Now, he's actually written several books with Abrams previously, actually with the same editor and designer as the Typeset in the Future book. He came across the blog. According to the foreword of the book, he then missed the deadline by spending several hours reading it. Similarly, went as deep as all these other people have and enjoying it. And to his eternal credit and with my gratitude, he actually reached out to Abrams, made the connection to his editor there, Eric, and said, you guys should speak. This, I think, would be of interest. And so that made the connection. So certainly having somebody with Matt's history, he's written New York Times bestsellers on the work of Wes Anderson. He's an extremely accomplished writer of movies. That definitely helped me, I think, as a new author, as an unpublished author. But yeah, the fact it had already proven there was an audience definitely didn't do any harm.
So once Abrams took it on, it looks like pretty challenging layout. There you've got lots of graphics and the type and the different settings for the interviews. That was all done by staff at Abrams?
The layout, yes, was actually done by Martin Benetsky, the designer we worked with on the project. The image research was all a part of my research in the book itself. So discovering these images, finding these complementary images was an integral part of the researching the story. And one thing I was very, very keen to do with this book, and I think it's mostly succeeded in, is every observational point that's made, wherever possible, is both written in words and then demonstrated through a visual. Because we're talking about an inherently visual medium. You want to see it without having to fast forward to 27 minutes into that movie to see, oh, I see how they did that. It gives you a much better combined mental model of how the storytelling was successful or not by having that visual to hand. So the image research was a huge part of the time, and image licensing was a huge part of the time involved. But I think it's essential for a movie like this. You have to communicate it visually as well as through words.
given that the fonts are such a topic in the book, the basic text of the book is a serif of some kind. Is it Roman, or that must have been a fairly significant choice when you were figuring out what the font of this book was going to be?
That was actually a choice made by Martin, by our designer. I deliberately did not try and suggest or influence the typeface that we should use, and he has much more experience of book design and book layout than I do. Also, in all honesty, I had so much research to do in finding and tracking down all of the typefaces in the movies that we were looking at that was one task I was happy to delegate to somebody else.
I think it's pleasing because to me it disappears, and the Roman font is something I'm so comfortable reading. And then, like in the interviews, it's more future, so you can tell the hand of a pro there and just how he laid it out as an attractive book.
He did a great job.
Are you able to move on with other work, or are you now living in the book again as it's newly published?
I've certainly found that the way I watch movies has been forever changed. This is a sacrifice I have made to bring this book into the world, is that I will now forever be looking at the details around the edges of the screen rather than the main part of the screen. But I think mostly I'm just really pleased to see how many other people are as equally obsessively detailed about the design and world building of these movies. And the beauty of sci-fi is there's at least another book's worth of movies that I could study again. I already have a short list of, if this book does well enough, of the ones I would love to write about. Whether I have the present day energy to spend another 2+ years researching it in the detail I have to, maybe a little break before tackling that. But there is not a shortage of world building out there to study.
The larger lesson that I took from it, too, is that if you have something you're passionate about, and you always have maybe from when you were young, and you put this much work into it, starting with, as you did, your blog and then a book, it almost seems like there's a promise in the way the world works these days, given the sort of total oversupply of things that you can spend time on, that something that's hooked that deeply to such a precise passion is kind of going to find its way through all the rest.
I agree, and it truly is a labor of love, this book. But I think one of the things I hadn't expected that I've seen it do, it's the kind of book that if you read it, you kind of feel a little bit smarter and more informed about these things that you already know in intimate detail. And I get a lot for free from the fact that people already love these movies. That makes a huge difference to people. It's like, I love these. I love Star Trek. I love Blade Runner. Therefore, I'm already bought into what the book is doing. But yeah, it certainly helps. I think also one thing that maybe isn't as obvious from the book is I was almost writing it in a slightly tongue-in-cheek style, truth be told. I was trying to bring some humor to the obsession, because it clearly is obsessive. I make no claims to the contrary. It is an obsessively detailed work. But I think being knowing about that and almost kind of making fun of oneself whilst doing it definitely helps temper some of the obsessive geekery.
Yeah, I remember there was one point where you talked about a fictitious international font association that had decided what the most representative font of the 1970s was, and I bought it. I thought it was good. You gave a hint that one was part of your tongue-in-cheekness. Definitely,
I think it would be potentially very, very dry to go into this level of detail of something without a little bit of humor thrown in for good measure, and I hope that comes true.
Yeah. Great. I have been speaking with Dave Addey, a designer and software developer whose book Typeset in the Future, Typography and Design in Science Fiction Movies was published last month by Abrams. Thanks very much, Dave.
Thank you.
In content, IMDB, which is the movie database business that Amazon acquired 20 years ago, is actually one of its very first acquisitions, now has a way for you to stream free movies and TV shows. There are some ads in them, and it's a little funky to get to it at this point. If you navigate to imdb.com/freedive, you can then watch them on your computer. They're also available supposedly at Fire TV, But when I tried it on the Fire TV hookup in our guest room here, I couldn't see the Freedive offering. So it's pretty new, and it's probably going to be rolling out. There are dozens of titles available now, not hundreds of thousands, and I suspect that'll grow in the future. I don't have a guest signed up yet. I've invited Craig Maude and also the founder of IMDB. So we'll see if either of them ends up on the show next week. If not, we haven't heard from Darlene for quite a while, so it might be a good time to catch up with how she's getting along with Alexa and her Kindle and all else. As promised, here are some chords that I'm learning for Those Were the Days.